Now, this attack has attracted some strong comments from the Trump administration, but just 2 days ago, they suggested that Bashar al-Assad didn't need to go for the Syrian war to end. So Joshua Landis is the director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma. He joins me now. Thanks very much for speaking to us, Joshua. So is the U.S. administration seriously considering military intervention in Syria?
Well, they're certainly considering how to uphold the international norm of not using chemical weapons. That was the norm that President Obama upheld for the years that he was in after the use in 2013, and he dissuaded Assad from using nerve gas after that. Now, obviously, Assad is testing President Trump, and we'll see. He did use strong language, and it would seem that he's going to do something.
And any indication as to what that might be? Obviously, his comments today in the joint press conference at the White House were very vague. He says that this is not the kind of thing that he discloses. But what kind of action might the U.S. take given Russia's present involvement in Syria?
Well, clearly, he's going to begin by talking to the Russians and seeing what they have to say. He's going to use undoubtedly some combination of diplomacy and military might, and we'll have to see what kind of combination he uses. He may want to differentiate himself from President Obama, who backed off from using military might and sought a diplomatic solution, which was using the Russians to get rid of, or at least what we believed were get rid of Assad's chemical weapons. We'll see if he strikes back and tries to put some fear in Assad about future use of chemical weapons.
And how might the Russians potentially respond to something like this? So far, there's been a war of words in the UN Security Council. The Russians have vehemently denied any involvement in the chemical attack, but of course, we've not heard anything from them on potential response to unilateral U.S. action.
Well, I presume that the U.S. will speak to Moscow first and warn them if they're going to use military might, because they have to disambiguate. They have to make sure that they don't hurt any Russian soldiers. So I think they'll have to cover this with the Russians, and they may, there's a wide palette of things that they can do. They can bomb airports and destroy the runways so that Syrian planes can't fly for a period of time. They could kill a bunch of Syrian soldiers. They could destroy command centers. We'll have to see what they choose to do.
And I suppose one of the things that haunted, or at least heavily influenced, the decisions of the Obama administration were events in Iraq in 2003. If there is a military strike on Syria, if we were to further down the line see some kind of crumbling of the Assad regime, what comes afterwards? What happens then?
Well, I would be very surprised if President Trump moves to the radical solution of regime change. I think the United States has drawn a line through regime change in Syria. President Obama looked at those options and didn't like what he saw, precisely for the question that you're asking, which is what comes after. And I don't think Trump's going to like it either. His entire policy for the Middle East has been based on reversing the notion of regime change and saying, he said the United States had been engaged in stupid wars because of regime change. It had created more chaos, spread al-Qaeda from one end of the Middle East to the other, from Libya to Yemen, Iraq, and he's supported strongmen. Now that he's got a strongman in Assad who's violating human rights and this norm of not using chemical weapons, he has to calibrate his policy and try to insist on human rights, even as he supports dictators, as we saw him do with Sisi just the other day, and embracing him, saying he's doing a very good job. He wants strongmen. He just wants them to behave in a way that America can support.
But in terms of what might be prompting all of this, yes, there has been outrage and anger in the aftermath of this chemical attack in Idlib, but we've had, if anything, there's been uncertainty and confusion over where the U.S. stands on Syria, and if anything, there was perhaps an indication that they might be backing away from too much opposition to Assad and Russia's position. Is much of this being driven by what's happening on the domestic front?
It is being driven, and it's also, President Trump has set down very clear goals, which is he wants to destroy ISIS and concentrate uniquely on ISIS. This use of chemical weapons by Assad takes him away from what he wants to be doing, and the Syrian situation has been taking the American presidency away from what they wanted to do. We remember that Obama wanted to pivot to Asia. He never got to do that, really. And President Trump wants to go after ISIS uniquely. He's not going to be able to do that. The situation in the Middle East, and particularly in Syria, is so explosive. And so here he has to deal with a very difficult problem of calibrating U.S. power to try to get what it wants. And unfortunately, the U.S. is, in a very, very difficult position in Syria.
Joshua Landis, thank you.